Welcome back to Ranch Beat, where every country song has a story, and we tell it. I'm James, and today we're taking a microscope to a song that changed the conversation about what a country ballad could feel like. Here's one surprising fact. People argued about who the narrator was, but the recording itself did more to shape that argument than the words alone. Now here's where it gets interesting. The vocal production pulled off a kind of optical illusion.
Let me add one thing to that. This episode is evidence first. We'll walk the timeline, look at the recording choices, and then listen carefully to how those choices steer interpretation. No hot takes without sources. Stick with us.
Fast overview. The song is Girl Crush by Little Big Town, released in the 2010s, a slow-burning country soul ballad built around close three-part harmonies, a low lead timbre, and a spare rhythm track. If you've heard it 100 times, get ready. By the end of this episode, you'll hear it differently.
Quick ad. Released to radio and streaming with a strong promotional push. But the timeline that matters for our story starts in the writer's room, moves to the demo, and then to specific studio choices made during tracking and mixing. Timeline. First, the song was written in a collaborative session. Songwriters sketched a narrator and a situation in broad strokes, then a demo captured the emotional core. From demo to studio, the band and producer made deliberate choices, mic selection, vocal layering, reverb settings, and arrangement decisions that reframed the demo's intent. Radio reaction and early public interpretation followed the release performance, not necessarily the original demo notes.
Let's roll this back to the beginning. Before this was a hit, it was just an idea in a writer's room. But the way it was ultimately sung, the lead delivered low and smoky, the harmonies pressed close behind it, that's what caused some listeners to hear one kind of narrator and others to hear something else. That one line tells you everything. Production turned subjectivity into ambiguity.
Production clinic. Start with the lead timbre. The lead sits low in the chest voice rather than bright on the top, which in recording terms reduces spectral clarity and invites interpretation. Then add close three-part harmony stacking. Voices recorded tightly, often double-tracked or stacked across takes, mixed nearly on top of the lead. That creates a blended voice that sometimes reads as a single ambiguous narrator rather than a named I addressing a target directly.
Listen to how intimacy becomes ambiguity. A low lead voice sounds like someone confessing from inside their chest, and when three voices anchor that confession closely, you start asking, is this one person remembering? Is it collective longing? Or is it an address to a different kind of desire? If you've ever been in that situation, you know exactly what they're singing about, but production keeps you guessing in a deliberate way.
Space and reverb matter too. The track uses relatively dry left-right placement, with a shallow room reverb on the lead and slightly different tails on the harmonies. The drums and percussion are minimal, often a soft kick, brushes, or a distant click, so there are fewer rhythmic cues to lock you into a conventional narrative. That lack of rhythmic context makes the vocal the entire stage.
Now, here's where it gets interesting. When you remove obvious rhythmic signposts, listeners fill the space with their own assumptions. So production doesn't just color the song, it invites the listener to supply missing detail. That's partly why public reaction became a cultural puzzle rather than a simple lyrical debate.
We plan to play short, cleared audio clips to illustrate these points, 15 to 30 seconds, showing isolated harmony stacks and the full mix. Rights clearance is complicated, so if those clips couldn't be cleared, we used descriptive audio demonstrations and sourced archival quotes. For this episode, any direct examples we refer to are either cleared clips or clearly described reconstructions.
Lyric focus. We'll read 3 key lines and talk about narrator perspective. First line to listen for is the pivot line that many people fixated on. When you hear it against that low lead and stacked harmony, the emotional stake shifts. Listen to this line for a second as a claim about longing rather than an attack, and notice how production nudges you toward empathy.
Second line. Pay attention to pronoun placement and how close harmonies blur who I and you are in the mix. Third line. Notice the trailing syllables and space after a word. Small production fades or delays can add ambiguity about whether the narrator is speaking to someone or about a feeling. These are subtle but powerful choices.
Let me add one thing to that.
This isn't just clever writing, it's personal. But we must be careful not to attribute private intent. Production can suggest, it can't prove. That's why we anchor to credits and published statements where possible.
Interview segment, we sought a short, pre-cleared conversation with a credited songwriter or producer. When fresh interviews weren't possible, we relied on published, attributed quotes, clearly labeled as archival. For example, a published interview with a credited contributor described aiming for an intimate, almost confessional sound in the vocal booth, which matches the production choices we hear on the record. We present that as a documented intention rather than private speculation.
Here's the important ethical note. When we discuss public misreadings, we won't repeat harmful language or sensationalize. We'll describe the arc of the reaction, how radio programmers and the public reacted, how the band responded, without amplifying the worst takes. That one line tells you everything about why production can inflame or calm a controversy.
Radio response and public interpretation followed two tracks. Some stations and listeners heard the song as a literal address and reacted strongly. Others focused on vocal texture and emotional delivery, interpreting it as longing or admiration. Documented station reactions and band statements exist in press archives. We present these as public responses, not definitive proof of the writer's inner thoughts.
Credit and rights note. We cleared short clips where possible, and whenever we couldn't get clearance, we used descriptive demonstrations and credited archival quotes. If you hear a clip, it's been cleared for this episode. If not, know that we deliberately substituted a narrated example to avoid overstepping licensing or repeating harmful misreads.
Takeaway listening exercise. James, you want to lead the guided listen?
Yeah, for 3 minutes, find a quiet spot and play nothing, just your headphones and this voice. First, imagine the lead voice alone, low in the chest. Picture one person. Now add a second voice close behind it, almost on top. Hear how the story feels different? Now add a third harmony, glued tight. Notice the blur between narrator and chorus. That blur is production doing storytelling work. Next time you hear the record, try to separate the words from the vocal texture, and you might hear the narrator's emotional stake shift from accusation to longing.
That simple exercise reframes the whole song. The technical choices, mic placement, harmony treatment, sparse percussion, are storytelling tools. Production can create space for empathy or for controversy, depending on how listeners fill it in.
Wrap up. Why this matters. Because production is a narrative device, not just decoration. When we treat recording choices as part of the story, we get richer, more responsible interpretations. Next time you hear a song that seems to mean two different things, ask, what is the music nudging me to believe?
If you enjoyed this forensic listen, tell us what song you want us to pull apart next. We love getting timestamp suggestions. Send us snippets of what you hear, and we'll feature interesting ones on the show.
And before we go, Ranch Beat is about stories in the music. If this episode changed how you hear a song, please subscribe and leave a rating. Your little act helps keep deep, careful episodes like this coming.
Subscribe, drop a comment with your favorite lyric, and suggest a song, any country except Thailand, for us to unpack next. We read every submission.
Rant Beat, where every country song has a story, and we tell it. Thanks for listening.